Hi, I'm Armchair Warlord James.
Hi, I'm Armchair Warlord Morgan, and we're from ArmchairWarlords.com.
The purpose of this video is to go over the creation of a Cleric or a Divine Spellcaster in the Pathfinder role-playing game. This is part 2 of our series for creating a basic party of the 4 basic roles for a medieval style game. I'm going to take the role of a GM who's a fairly stickler on the rules, but not the total immersion style. And Morgan's going to take on the role of a player who wants to play a Cleric. So the first thing to do in deciding any character is to decide on a class, because a class is going to define everything about your character. So I'll start off by asking Morgan, what type of character are you thinking about playing?
Well, my favourite type is to play a healer that can also hold his own.
Okay, so for a healer who can hold his own in a fight, you're either going to be looking at a Cleric or a Druid. Paladins can heal, but they're not able to heal others very well, especially early on in the game, so we'll shy away from that and either go with the Cleric, who can do a lot of healing and has the spontaneous casting ability, or the Druid, who can heal pretty well but doesn't have the spontaneous ability and also is slightly less effective in combat.
So yeah, my favourite class in the game is Cleric, so I'll pick Cleric.
Okay, so we go to the Cleric section of the core rulebook, which starts on page 39, and the first thing we come to is class skills. So we'll have Morgan go down his character sheet and check off all of his class skills. And for a Cleric, these are going to be Appraise, Craft, Diplomacy, Heal, Knowledge of Arcana, Knowledge of History, Knowledge of Nobility, Knowledge of the Planes, Knowledge of Religion, Linguistics, Profession, Sense Motive, and Spellcraft. After he's checked those off, the next thing we come to are class features. Now, just like the previous video, we're going to have him write his class features in the special abilities section, just because these character sheets aren't divided out into class features and racial traits. So the first class feature is his weapon and armor proficiencies. So Clerics are proficient with all simple weapons, light and medium armor, and shields, with the exception of tower shields. Clerics are also automatically proficient with their deity's favored weapon. He hasn't chosen a deity yet, so he doesn't know what that is, but it's just something to keep in mind. The next thing we come to is an aura. All Clerics exude an aura, especially those who are of one of the diametrically edged alignments, such as lawful, chaotic, good, or evil. Neutral Clerics don't necessarily put out an aura, but any of the ones who have one of the end alignments are going to. So he doesn't know his alignment yet, so he's just going to write aura in his class features. The next thing is spells. Spells can get a little complicated, and we haven't gone over those in the video yet, so we're going to save that until later on in this video. The next thing for a starting Cleric is channeling energy. Unlike the original D20 system where Clerics could heal people and turn undead, Clerics in Pathfinder start out being able to channel energy, which means that they can put out a wave of energy in a radius that affects everyone around them. Good Clerics will put out positive energy, evil Clerics will put out negative energy, and neutral Clerics can choose whether to put out positive or negative energy. But keep in mind they can only make that decision once, right at the beginning of the game, and once made it can't be changed. The next thing we'll come to is domains. Like spells, we're going to cover this later once Morgan's chosen a deity for his character. The next thing for a starting Cleric is orisons. Again, Pathfinder departed from the original D20 rule set by making 0 level spells something that could be cast over and over and over again in a day without using up a spell slot. You're still limited in the number that you can select, but once you've selected those, you can cast them an unlimited number of times per day. And the last thing is spontaneous casting. Now for a Cleric, this means that no matter what spells he's memorized for a particular day, he can at any time drop one of those spells and substitute in a healing spell of the same level and use that spell whenever he chooses.
Alright, I've just jotted those down. I've made sure to note what page the special abilities are on within the rulebook so I can quick reference them later.
Alright, so he's chosen his class. The next thing to choose is a race. So Morgan, what race do you see your character being in this game?
Well, we've previously chosen a dwarf, so I'll mix it up a little bit and I will select a human.
Okay.
I like the option of having the extra feet, especially as a magic caster. And the fact that I can choose to put my +2 to an ability score into anyone I want means I can essentially max out my chosen stat, which will most doubt be Wisdom.
That's a very good choice. Humans are not really good at anything. They're not really bad at anything. They're your jack-of-all-trade type characters. They're very generic. They're useful for pretty much any class. They do make good clerics. There aren't a lot of better choices in the core races. There are plenty of better ones in the advanced race guide and some of the other more complex supplements. But just for now, we'll go with human as a good choice for a cleric. So the first thing about humans is that they get +1 or +2 to any one ability score. So as Morgan said, wisdom being the key attribute for a cleric, he's going to put that +2 next to his wisdom. The next thing is that they're medium sized. Humans also have normal speed, meaning they can move 30 feet or 6 squares per round on a battle net. They get a bonus feat, which is just something to make a note of. Humans are skilled, meaning at the beginning and every time they level up, they get 1 additional skill point on top of any others that they might get. So Morgan's chosen his class and he's chosen his race. Now it's time to generate his ability scores. We're going to stick with the same system that we used before, which is the point buy at the high fantasy rate. So he's going to get 20 points to spend on increasing his ability scores.
Alright, because my character is essentially a healer or a caster, I want to concentrate my high stats. I want to purchase more points and stack them into my ability score that governs the amount I can cast or the bonuses I will get to casting. So of course that would be wisdom. So I will purchase a score of 15 for my wisdom, which due to my selecting a human as my race, I'll add the previous +2 to that wisdom, which essentially jacks that up to a 17. My next ability I'll select my strength. It's good to have a bit of strength. You don't want to stack too many points in your strength because yes, you are a frontline fighter, but there's other people in the party who are supposed to do that role, so you don't have to burn a heap of points doing strength, but a little bit of strength is good. So I'll throw a score of 12 into strength. My next stat, which is dexterity. Being a caster that can hold his own, I will want to not necessarily have a terrible dexterity, but I don't necessarily need a great dexterity because I'm going to select a decent amount of armor and I'm not going to be nimbly jumping around the battlefield. Also, because I'm a divine caster, I don't have to worry about the arcane spell failure chance of a suit of armor, so I can later on sort of advance my character to wearing bigger and heavier armors. So I'm going to purchase a score of 10 for dexterity. Constitution, because I'm probably going to take a few hits, it's usually a good idea to have a decent constitution. I'm not a frontline fighter, but the fact that I'm right behind the frontline fighters, providing healing, buff spells, and also throwing spells at the enemy, I will be a lucrative target for the enemy. So I want to have a few extra hit points up my sleeve, as well as a few of the other fortitude type bonuses that a good constitution will provide. So I'm going to purchase a score of 14 for my constitution. Now the next one, intelligence. Clerics, I mean, they're not supposed to be a role which has tons of skill points, nor will you be doing that much problem solving and thinking. That's more your domain of the rogue type classes and the arcane casters. So I am going to give myself a little bit of intelligence, but not, you know, a super high score. So I'll purchase an intelligence of 12. And my remaining attribute, which is charisma. Now, normally, as a sort of more veteran player, when I'm using sort of martial classes like fighters and barbarians, I'll use my charisma as a dump stat, meaning I'll put pretty much 0 points into it. However, for a cleric, you'll want to have a slightly higher charisma because there are certain feats which require a minimum charisma score, as well as if you want to use your positive energy to turn undead, you'll need, like, essentially the better the charisma, the better chance you have of pulling that off. So I'm going to give myself a 13 in charisma because that's all I've got left, which will provide me a +1 bonus, which is, you know, it's not much, but it's better than nothing, and it will allow me to purchase those feats that I desire later.
This is a good point to note that this piggybacks on what we were talking about before about always having a plan for your character. So Morgan knows ahead of time how he's going to purchase his feats and how he wants to build his character out and what he wants it to look like once it's leveled up. So he knows to go ahead and purchase a minimum score of 13 in his charisma so that he can qualify for the prerequisites for the feats that he wants to select as a beginning character. So we'll pause for a minute here and let Morgan fill in all of the parts of his character sheet where the ability score modifiers are going to come into play. Alright, so Morgan has chosen his class, he's chosen his race, and he's generated his ability score. So the next thing we're going to look at is skills. Now, like a fighter, clerics don't get many skill points, so he's got to be very wise with his selection of skills because his points are sparing. As a human, he does get a +1 bonus. It doesn't make a huge difference, but it is kind of useful, especially early on.
Alright, so previously James got me to check off my class skills. So basically I'm just going to go down there, and because I'm a level 1 I can't have more than my level in skill points assigned to any of my skills. So I'm essentially going to go down and put 1 point into 4 of my skills because I've got 2 plus my intelligence bonus of 1 plus the fact that I'm a human gives me an extra 1, so that's 4 all up. So I'm going to select diplomacy as 1 because I don't believe our previous fighter took any points into diplomacy. Heal, because even though I'm a magic healer and you don't necessarily have to roll in order to successfully heal somebody when you have magic, it's always a good idea as a cleric to have some mundane healing just so that you can perform heal checks in order to check the condition of somebody perhaps. You know, if they're unconscious, they may not be able to tell you what's wrong with them and you may have to look them over, stop bleeding. You also can run out of cure spells and healing spells, so you may have to revert back to using bandages and splints. My next points I'll throw in knowledge religion, because if you fail a religion roll as a cleric, the whole party laughs at you because that's pretty much your whole job. And then my last one I'll put a point into spellcraft, and that takes me into my 4.
Alright, so the next thing we're going to look at is feats. Feats for a cleric are a little bit easier to decide on than those for a fighter. You don't get as many feats as a cleric, so you do have to think more about your plan and decide which feats you want, but there aren't as many feats that are useful to a cleric, so he has a smaller pool to choose from.
So basically, as a cleric, one of my biggest advantages besides spellcasting is my ability to channel energy. So I like to focus on that because to me it's just sort of a free bonus I can throw out as a standard action, you know, whenever it's my turn. So I'm going to choose 2 feats to spend on enhancing and changing the way I channel energy. So my first feat I'm going to select is extra channeling, which essentially gives me 2 extra channels every single day. So that's 2 extra attempts at healing my allies or damaging the undead. The second feat I'm going to select is called selective channeling. Now, normally when you channel energy, it will just erupt from your body in a burst of energy. So across a 30 feet radius around you, it will essentially bathe everything in that circle in positive energy. So if you're backing up the fighters and you perhaps run out of cure spells, you thought, I will throw down a channel positive energy. Not only will you heal all your allies which are in that circle, but you may also, should there be enemies in that circle that are healed by positive energy, so pretty much anything that's not undead, they'll also benefit from your healing, and so I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is take selective channeling, which will essentially allow me to select who I want to benefit from my channeling.
Alright, so Morgan has selected his feats and his skills to complement his class, his race, and his ability score, so now we're going to move on to equipment. Now, equipment for a cleric is going to be very similar to equipment for a fighter. However, there are some other considerations that clerics have to make. Being healers, they need to ensure that they have some specialized healing equipment, and also every cleric needs a holy symbol or something that represents his deity that gives him the ability to channel his deity's power. Because as a divine spellcaster, his power comes from his relationship to the deity and not necessarily from the strength of his own will.
Okay, so referring back to James's previous video about always getting rope, that's the first thing I always choose. Before weapons and armor, I always make sure I throw down some rope, because 50 feet of rope, you would be surprised how handy that comes in.
So, with Morgan being a cleric, when he comes to his weapon choice, he's going to want to choose a weapon that is aligned to the deity that he's selected. Now, because we haven't gone over deity selection yet, we're going to hold off on weapon selection for now. What Morgan's going to do is set aside about 30 or 40 gold pieces to make sure that he can purchase any weapon that could possibly be related to any deity that he chooses. He'll come back to that after he's chosen his deity. So we're going to go ahead and move on to armor. And as a cleric, and as he was saying before, he wants to make his cleric to be able to hold his own in battle. He's going to want to select the best armor that he can afford at this point, which is most likely going to be medium armor.
Yeah, basically that's correct. I'm going to select Scale Mail because I feel that that is the best balance of armor bonus with maximum dex bonus, as well as any of the negatives that may apply for armor check penalties.
And being players that have played for a while, we already have a good idea of the weapon selections that are available to a cleric based on his deity choice. The vast majority of those are one-handed weapons, and so being a cleric who wants to be able to take hits, Morgan's also at this point going to select a shield.
Yeah, because I'm probably going to run out of money, I'm going to try and be as thrifty as possible with my shield, so I'm going to forego getting a heavy steel shield, and I'm going to be a little bit more tight-fisted and go for a heavy wooden shield. It offers the same bonus, however it is lighter and doesn't cost as much money.
Alright, the next thing to purchase is his general equipment that is the list of equipment that pretty much everyone's going to want to have. It's the same thing we went over in the previous video. He's going to want a backpack, he's going to want a water skin, some travel rations, a bedroll, etc. So we'll pause for a minute and let him make those equipment choices. So after Morgan's made his general equipment selections, being a cleric, as we mentioned before, he's going to want to pick up a holy symbol and possibly a healer's kit. Healer's kits are fairly expensive. They cost 50 gold pieces. Unless you just have the extra money to burn, it's not necessarily a good investment. What it does is add +2 to your heal checks. So as a level 1 character, a +2 can make a huge difference, but again, unless you've just got the money to spend, it's not really worth it.
I forego buying a healer's kit. My party's not worth 50 gold pieces to me at this point.
Alright, so now we'll move on to the additional rules, where we'll go over alignment choice. Now, alignment choice is very important for a cleric because when a cleric is selecting a deity, his alignment has to be within one step of that deity's alignment. Meaning that if the deity is a neutral good, the player cleric has to either be lawful good, neutral good, or chaotic good. He can't be any version of neutral and he can't be any version of evil. So we'll ask the question the same way we asked Dan. Morgan, do you see your character being more moral and doing good things, or more amoral and doing bad things?
I think to fit in with the party, I'll go with, for this turn, we'll go with a moral character.
Okay, so he's going to be some variation of good. So is your character going to be more law-abiding, or someone who doesn't necessarily follow the rules as long as he accomplishes a good end?
I think I'll go with somebody who doesn't necessarily follow the law of the land.
Okay, so that sounds to me like chaotic good. So the next thing we can fill in are the random starting ages and the random heights and weights. And we'll do this the same way we did it in the previous video. So we'll pause for a second and let Morgan fill those spots in. Alright, the next thing we come to is carrying capacity. So again, this is based solely on the strength score. So we'll go to the back sheet and we'll look up Morgan's strength score on the table, which is a 12, which means that his light load is 43 pounds or less.
Correction, that should be a 13. I stuffed on mine.
So we'll go to the table and find Morgan's strength score of 13, which gives him a light load of 50 pounds or less. Carrying capacity is something to keep in mind if you're playing with a GM who's a real stickler on rules such as encumbrance and having players justify where they're packing away all the loot that they collect in a dungeon. Some dungeons that you run through will have far more loot than any 4 people can carry in their arms. So some GMs will want to enforce the rule that, you know, you can't realistically carry 10 very expensive tapestries out of this dungeon. Some DMs won't really pay attention to it. It doesn't matter because it kind of detracts from the flow of the game. And you always want to make sure that you're balancing flow versus adherence to the rules. So for Morgan's 13 score, it gives him a medium load of 51 to 100 pounds and a heavy load of 100 to 150 pounds. That's going to translate into a lift overhead of 150 pounds, a lift off the ground of 300 pounds, and a push or drag of 750 pounds. Alright, so with any normal character who's not a spellcaster, this is where we would end the section. Morgan would fill in all the little details and sum and total up all of his boxes. But because Morgan's chosen a cleric, we need to discuss things like deity choice, domains and domain powers, as well as spellcasting. So because Morgan chose a chaotic good character, he's going to have to choose a deity that's within one step of his own chaotic good alignment. So if you go to the cleric section of the class chapter, there is quite an extensive list of deities to choose from on page 43 of the core rulebook. There's a long table that gives you the deity's name, their alignment, their portfolio, which is basically the aspects of existence that that deity is supposedly in charge of, as well as domains and their favored weapon. So Morgan, you've chosen a chaotic good alignment. You've got quite a selection of deities to choose from. Which one do you think most aligns with how you want your character to behave in the game?
Alright, so I want to consider the domain options, because domains will give you very specific powers as well as free spells that you can cast every day. So my 2 favourite domains when I'm playing a healing cleric is to obviously the domain of healing as well as the domain of fire, because that will give me very potent offensive spells essentially for free. So I'm going to choose a deity that's one step of my alignment that has both of those domains, which would be Sarenrae.
Alright, Sarenrae is a neutral good deity. She's the goddess of the sun, redemption, honesty, and healing. Her domains include fire, glory, good, healing, and sun, and her favored weapon is a scimitar. It's important to note here the rule that clerics are always proficient in the weapon of their favorite deity. Sarenrae uses a scimitar, which is a martial weapon that clerics aren't normally proficient with when they start the game.
So I've obviously written scimitar into my weapon slot because that's the weapon I should choose, and it's also I've got enough money to purchase it.
Alright, so we'll go to the healing domain. Every domain has a list of granted powers. Most of these are divided into 2 sections. The first is a power that the cleric will acquire immediately, and another is a more powerful version or a different power completely that is more powerful in another aspect that the cleric will acquire at later levels. So for healing, the first granted power is called Rebuke Death. What this allows the cleric to do is so many times per day he can touch a living creature and instantly restore so many hit points. This will be extremely useful to Morgan as a healing cleric because it will allow him to save party members from death if they've been incapacitated, or potentially save an enemy who could turn out to be a very useful source of information.
Now I've gone ahead and jotted down under my special abilities in the domain section. I've written in, I've written in what my domains are, which is healing and fire, and then I've filled out below the rebuke death power. I've included how many times per day I can cast it, just as a quick reference to myself, as well as the page that I can reference it in the book.
Also, the last part of a domain entry is going to be the domain spells. Now, these spells can only be cast once the cleric has leveled up far enough to have access to that level of spell. This is also an additional spell that they can cast each day that goes above and beyond their normal spell pool. So a cleric begins the game able to cast 3 0-level spells and 1 1st-level spell every day, but they can add their domain spell to that, meaning that they can cast 2 level 1 spells. So the level 1 domain spell for healing is Cure Light Wounds. The next domain that Morgan chose was the domain of fire. The granted power for the fire domain is called Firebolt. This will allow Morgan to basically extend his hand at a target and cast a gout of flame at them that does some fairly significant damage, pretty much equivalent to a strike from a melee weapon.
And I followed that up with the exact same entry I made for Rebuke Death, the name, how many times a day I can cast it, as well as the page in which I can reference in the rulebook.
Alright, and the first level domain spell is Burning Hands. Now it's important to note here that even though you have access to 2 domains and 2 domain spells per level, you can only choose to cast 1 of those per day. So you have to make the decision between casting the healing domain spell or the fire domain spell. Also, it's important to note here that domain spells don't necessarily have to be divine spells. They can be arcane spells. Burning Hands in particular is normally an arcane spell. Keep in mind that because it's a domain spell granted to a cleric, it's still cast as a divine spell, meaning that it's not subject to arcane spell failure from armor wear. The next thing we're going to discuss is Morgan's spell selection. Now, clerics are divine casters, and they have their own specific list of spells in the book. Now also, clerics can be extremely powerful spell casters. They have 9 levels of spells plus the 0-level orisons that they can choose from. Now when they're choosing 0-level spells, remember that they can cast a 0-level spell an unlimited number of times per day, meaning that the 3 spells he selects he can cast over and over again as often as he wants.
Alright, so the 3 spells I will choose to start with will be Detect Magic. Obviously it's very handy if you're a low-level party, being able to essentially passively detect, after you've cast a spell obviously, if there is any other magic auras within your proximity. Another one I will cast will be Light, because unlike the Dwarven Fighter we just created before in the previous video, I can't see in the dark, so that's also a good one that I can cast for free. And the next one will be Mending. It essentially makes minor repairs to an object, and I can cast it over and over again, so you'd be surprised how much mending you can do in a day. For my first level spell selection, it's important to remember back to the spontaneous casting ability of a cleric, which allows you to swap out any chosen spell in your memorized repertoire with a cure spell or a healing spell. So when you're choosing your spell, to maximize your diversity, never choose a cure spell or a healing spell in your cleric spell list, because if you want to, you can just swap it out and choose to cast that power as a cure or heal. So for my level 1 spell, for now I will choose Magic Weapon.
Basically what this spell will allow Morgan to do is imbue his weapon or anyone else's weapon with a +1 bonus, also making it a magic weapon for the purposes of passing through damage reduction or inflicting additional damage on an enemy. It's also important to note at this point that unlike a wizard, A cleric has access to every spell and every list on these pages once he has leveled up to the point where he can cast a spell at that level. So at level 1, Morgan can actually choose from all the 0 level spells and all the 1st level spells. Clerics don't have to learn spells, they derive them from the power of their god. So what they do every day is pray or meditate or memorize all the spells that they want to be able to use during the coming day or during the next 24-hour period.
And if you wish, when you go to rest that evening, you can meditate and then change up any of your spells you selected from the previous day for any of the other spells that you can find in your cleric spell list in your applicable levels. So, you know, if you enter into a new terrain and so you need to perhaps swap out some of your damage dealing spells or maybe some survivability spells, or if you're coming up against just consistent undead when, you know, you may have only prepared for another type of monster, you can take this opportunity to review and swap out any spells you may need to be a more effective caster and support your party.
It's also a good thing to keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to sleep between memorizing spells. The book only technically specifies that you need 8 hours of uninterrupted rest or meditation. So you can pause, sit down, pray for 8 hours, and you've completely gained the ability to rearrange your spells as you see fit. Alright, so having selected his class, his race, and generated his ability scores, Morgan then selected his skills and feats and added in the bits and pieces of his biological and demographical data. Then he went through and selected his deity, his domain, and his spells. This is a complete picture for a cleric. So at this point, Morgan would go through his character sheet and fill in any remaining boxes, going back and making sure that he's taken into account things like his alignment for his aura, so that he can know that his aura is going to be a good aura, so that any creature attempting to detect him by alignment is going to have a much easier time of detecting him if they're looking for good.
Another thing that's important to note is because I left my weapon selection till last, I forgot to choose any backup weapons. A good backup weapon to choose is always a small, light bladed weapon. These come in handy for any number of situations where you may not have the room to utilize your main medium-sized weapon. So, you know, should you get swallowed or grappled or entangled, you know, having a 1d4 dagger to cut your way out of a purple worm's belly is infinitely better than sitting there and burning to death in its acid.
This has been part 2 of our segment of videos about character creation for beginners, where we're going to go through creating a character for each of the 4 main archetypes for a medieval fantasy game: the fighter, the utility character, the divine caster, and the arcane caster. So we've covered the fighter and we covered the divine caster. The next segment will cover our utility character, which is most likely going to be a rogue. So if you like this video, please hit like, and we'd appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. It'll let us know that people are paying attention and give us an idea of what videos we need to put out in the future. And I'm James Coker with Armchair Warlords.
And I'm Morgan with Armchair Warlords.
And thanks for watching.